Canadian Indigenous Chamber of Commerce. I was president of PT Capital when they came in, when Mr. McCoshen and Mr. Sharp came in as an investor in PT Capital, and also asked us to put together the economic modeling on the project. And later, when I left PT Capital, I took on a position as an officer at A2A. You're hearing from Don McCammon today, but his colleague Bill Hayjolt is also at HDR, and HDR is one of the world's leading rail practice engineering firms and has worked on railroads literally all over the world. And so Bill and Don and a group of others at HDR have been working with us. And I can go on. Doug Ford has been working in Canada on working with indigenous groups. And John Katchen, who had worked with Senator Dan Sullivan when he was Commissioner of Natural Resources and Attorney General, is our lawyer and our Alaska lead. You've met Joy and Sean tonight, but it's actually a really cool team to be working with. And there are others, but these are some of the folks that are working the Alaska issues day by day. Let me go to the next slide if we can. Sean, and the project overview is very simply this. You know, the Alaska Railroad right now terminates at North Pole, though it has a permit through the Northern Rail Extension to terminate at Delta Junction. And the bridge that went across at Salcha was built not only to give access to military training lands, but also to be part of ultimately moving the Alaska Railroad to the lower 48. For this project, it's about a 1,500-mile project from Delta to the terminus in Alberta, where we would connect with the Canadian National and the Canadian Pacific Rail line. We would go along the Alaska Highway to Tok, and then move through the Ladue River Valley into the Yukon, travel north of Whitehorse through several very significant mineralized areas in a little bit of the Northwest Territories and down to Alberta. One of the other substantial advantages of this project, and something that's likely to create a lot of jobs in interior Alaska, is that the shipping times, as you know, Anchorage is the same longitude as Honolulu, so we're basically halfway across the Pacific. And the idea that a ship can bring goods to Anchorage, get it on a rail line, and that might be transmissions made in a Japanese factory that are going into American-built cars, as just an example. You can pretty much unload those containers in Anchorage, get them on the rail line, and have them in Detroit before the ship might have ever gotten to Seattle or Long Beach. So it's quite a significant savings in transportation for people who need that just-in-time service. Next slide. I mentioned this is 1,500 miles, 1,600 miles, depending on whether we're connecting in Delta or in North Pole. As you know, the Northern Rail Extension is 83 miles from Delta to North Pole. The bridge across the Tanana was constructed already, and it's 512 miles from North Pole to Seward, about a little less than 400 miles down to Anchorage. We would be using long trains, long unit trains to pay for this. It'd have 2 locomotives, 96 cars, 3 locomotives, 96 cars, and 2 locomotives at the end. Don is going to be able to talk about that. They're long trains, and so one of the things that I know was a question that came up at your council meeting last week, we're going to be working to have the track above or below grade. In other words, bridges over roads or under roads, or roads going over the track. There'll be unit trains carrying bulk commodities, and they'll have mixed freight and intermodal. In other words, the kinds of containers that can move across, move off rail cars onto truck. And there's also going to be an opportunity for passenger service. The last thing I'll say about this map is you look at it, there's a purple line. The red line shows what we'd call the main line to connect to Delta. We are also looking at an alternative that would raise the costs about 10%, all told, maybe a little bit more, to also go down to Valdez, where you have the oil port now and the terminus of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. There had been some discussion about, and in the original Van Horn study, there had been some discussion about transferring oil from Alberta to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, either at Delta Junction or Glen Allen. What we found after extensive discussions with the pipeline and the producers is that you pretty much change the quality of North Slope crude with a very different quality of heavier oil coming out of Alberta, to the point where it makes sense to go directly to a tidewater location. So our options are essentially Valdez or probably the Port McKenzie in the Mat-Su Valley, just across from Anchorage. Let's go to the next slide. I mentioned that it's going to be a mixed commodity, a mixed wide range of cargo. You've got general cargo, you've got bulk, dry, and liquid cargo. Some of the production in North America, and this is both in the United States, central part of the United States, as well as Canada, that have constraints right now on transportation, include grain, potash, sulfur, bitumen. I doubt we'll be moving gravel from the lower 48, but there's lots of places around Alaska that we have to move gravel. Propane, oil, minerals, wine, vegetable oils, etc., as well as bulk cargo where you see a pipe car or something like that, refrigerated cargo in terms of meat and dairy commodities, and then roll-on, roll-off cargo for trucks, where you'll have at Delta Junction is called a junction because it connects a couple of highways. Tok is another where you're likely to see intermodal ports. Fairbanks is a third where you're likely to see intermodal ports, and we'll go from there. Finally, there's passenger service as well as the military option. Joy tells me we've got a question, so Joy, if you can let us know the question, I'm happy to answer any questions at this time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Meade. And our question is, will the Alaska Railroad own the right-of-way in Alaska, and will there be a power swap with locomotives at some point? Thank you for your question.
Great. So right now, the business idea that we pursued with the Alaska Railroad, we signed a master agreement last summer with the Alaska Railroad that had kind of an agreement to agree on several different things. What we agreed to in terms of the right-of-way is, because under state law they have the right to select a right-of-way to Canada, that we would do the engineering and work on the route selection and permitting with them, and they would select the right-of-way from DNR and lease that to the A2A Railroad for the portion from Delta Junction to the Canadian border. So that's going to be owned by the Alaska Railroad in terms of the actual land lease, and the rail line built above it would be owned by A2A as things stand now. We also have an agreement to have joint and through operations, and I'll put it this way: rail crews like truck crews and so forth have a limit to the number of hours people can work in a day, so you're going to need to change crews several different places. It's unlikely that we're going to change engine power where we interconnect with the railroad, but it is likely that we're going to change crews once the Canadian crews come into Alaska and vice versa. And that'll be worked out with the railroad. We've come up with a couple of draft operating plans, but I hope that answers your question. In terms of power, I don't see us for these long unit trains changing engine locomotive power, but we could in certain instances. I hear there's another question.
Yes, we have another question. The question is, will there be a siding in Delta to bring fertilizer into the farmers' co-op?
Without knowing exactly where, I can say I'm sure that we would work toward that. Sean, did you have something you wanted to add there?
I just wanted to ask, can folks see the Q&A box? I was pulling that up in hopes that folks could, so they could follow along. Joy, when I bring the Q&A box up, does that appear under this shared screen?
No, I think people just look at it individually. So, and I think they can see they see their questions and they can see all the questions. I'm not sure if they see the answer. So
Okay.
I'm reading them just so we can all kind of hear the answer together too.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yep, no problem. And while we're paused here, I would like to also see if there's any questions from any of our participants on the material that we have presented so far. Again, with the phone line, press *9. And if you are dialing in or logging on through your computer, just press the raise hand button. And you'll have many more opportunities to ask questions and then an opportunity for comments at the end of the meeting.
And Joy and me, this is Don. To further answer the question on the siding, when the NRE route was approved by the STB, one of its goals was to bring service to Delta Junction. That not only would provide service to the village town of Delta Junction, but also to the base that's there. So definitely there would be a spur for both local use and then connecting with the base.
Awesome, thank you, Don. And I don't see any hands raised or any other questions in the Q&A box. Again, I will pause for questions in a few slides here. And I think if you move to the next slide, Sean, I believe we are handing it over to Don now. And Don, I believe you can see the screen now, so we won't be prompting you for what's on the slide.
Yes, thanks. Once in a while, the electronic gods line up. The alignment connects with a railroad that's 2,200 or 1,600 miles or so long in Canada. And as that route was looked at, it basically comes from the White River up the Ladue River, across the border, and then continues to follow the Ladue River basin all the way over to where it crosses the hills or mountains between Ladue drainage and Canada drainage. And then it goes through Tetlum Junction, past Coast, and Dot Lake and Dry Creek all the way up and connects to the end of the northern rail extension that the Alaska Railroad did back in 2010. We've taken a look at the lands. We've gone through iterations of the alignment. So the original alignment that some of you may remember way back when, 2016, and the initial meetings that might have been conducted, and some of you attended. We've better aligned the alignment. We've worked on it, and we'll talk about that as we go through here. We've also looked at the land ownership that's been involved, the environmental considerations, and we're working very closely with the Alaska Railroad as well. So those are all things that we've done on this alignment. And as well, when you think of crossing the border, we also have a border station or a port of entry, and we'll talk about that as well, and what we've done with that as we go through. These are all things that we've worked on, and the whole goal as we've refined this alignment is actually to get it to better fit the environment, to avoid crossing areas that haven't been worked on or developed before, and also avoid some areas that impact homeowners and industries and businesses and look at agriculture areas. Those things, we've tried to avoid those as much as possible. We work. Go ahead, Ollie. So, as I've said, well, we talked on this corridor. We wanted to use anything that was previously. If we could get next to the Alaska Highway, we did. If we followed some other road, we did that. We need to stay a safe distance away, but if we could follow a pipeline alignment, we did. Power lines, the same thing. Again, it's all where our design standards allow, and we've got some very strict design standards. This is not like moving your car up and down the hills when you're talking about these long trains and the heavy tonnage that each trains weigh. We're talking trains that are anywhere from 14,000 to 19,000 tons as far as what's being moved per train. We've looked at how we could minimize earthwork impact. We need to address side hill construction because it minimizes big fills and deep cuts. But we also have to take into account the permafrost and how we balance that out. We reduced tunnel length. The original alignment had 2 tunnels over 3.5 miles or so in length. We're down to 1 tunnel, 1 mile in length. And we also need to reduce bridge height. Tunnels are the single most expensive cost per foot. If you think of it, that's $26,000 a foot. Essentially, a small car is being bought per foot of tunnel. If you can think of it that way, that's a good way to think about it. Bridges are also expensive. The taller, higher bridges get up to be as expensive as the tunnel. So we need to look at ways we can reduce that, as well as provide the right angle crossings of streams and rivers, avoid wetlands as much as we can, provide for mitigation if we need to, and then we also need to avoid parallel alignments of floodplains. You can imagine if we built down the Tanana floodplain, we'd block part of that water off and we'd play havoc with the flood of the Tanana, and that's something we're not willing to do. And I don't think anybody wants us to do that either. We also need to, as we go near national parks or noted fisheries, stay on the opposite side of the road that passes by those areas for other disturbances when we pass those. And then we have some train operations as well. If we get below 10 miles per hour speed, we start damaging the rail. The wheels on the locomotives actually start spinning. And if you can imagine your car spinning in gravel, that's exactly what a steel wheel does on steel rail. So those are things we have to do. At the same time, we need to be able to stop safely and provide for that braking ability. Curves and grades drain energy on moving a train. If you think of your car going around the curve, and it might lug down a little bit, that's the same thing that happens to the train. As well as if we get too much force pulling or pushing that train, we get what's called pull aparts. It's the train actually breaks apart, breaks in two. Those metal curves that they have, what's called nuts, actually break. Or we can cause a derailment. The train runs into each other and a car pops off. The next thing you know, you have 30 or 40 cars piled in about 40 feet of area. And we do not want to do that. So we've got to have very good safe operations to operate that. Go ahead, Sully. So I like this graphic, and I apologize for those who like the English unit, but it works out very simple in this one in metric. If you have a 6% grade, you can see that line going up, and that's pretty typical of a lot of your roads, and max out around 6%, 7%. On the railroads, we max out at 1.5%, or 4 times less than your 6% highway grade. And if you want to think on that in metric, which gets to be a little bit of a problem, it's 79 feet of rise every mile traveled. That is really flat. You think about it. That's the constraints we've got to work with in the grade. And as many of you know, around Alaska, it is definitely not flat. So it's been a challenge to get things to fit with the environment. I think we've got that. And then when we talked about rail terminals and we talked about the siding or spur that would be in Delta Junction, that grade essentially is flat, partially descending away because we want to prevent any cars that might get loose running through the switch and getting on the main line and then running downhill to who knows where. We need to stop those. And I've been involved in a couple railroads and derailments around the area where the train is derailed, and the university that was there in one derailment got brand new windows and roofs in the gymnasium and a couple other major buildings because of the explosion that occurred after the train derailed. So those are things we need to design against and prevent with our safety plan on the railroad and make it safe. Those are extremely unusual occurrences, but they're unusual because we designed for it. Go ahead, Sully. So this is a good drawing, I think. It's a very dry part of Alaska. For those of you who are familiar with Alaska, there is a corner that looks like this. Actually, if you strip away the grasses and the trees and the vegetation, it probably does look like this. But this is how we initially started looking through the alignment and to get it to fit. We actually drew a red line, see where the stream is, see where the contours are, see what our grades look like, and then try to fit that with the terrain. That's some of the exercises that we've gone through to get the alignment to fit where it is now. Go ahead, Polly. And while Solly's switching, and before I start into some of the details, are there any questions, Joy?
Yeah, thank you for pausing, Don, to see if we had questions. And I do see that the library the Delta Library has raised its hand, and so there must be a question there, and your line is open. And we also have a question from the Q&A box that I will read for the group as well after we have the Delta Library ask their question. Handing it over to you now. Your line is open.
Pete Hallgren here in Delta. I think you're saying that you're going to have trains that are a little over 2 miles long, and you're going to go at least 10 miles an hour, but that means that somewhere around, it'll take about 10 minutes for a train to pass fully by one point. Am I correct?
That sounds about right. And that's one of the reasons why me mentioned, and we're committed to doing the grade separations and then working with the residents and landowners to provide for grade separated undercrossings and overcrossings as we need to get across the land and maintain that connectivity through the railroad right away.
Okay. How often or how many trains a day are you planning on?
We could have around 8 to 10 trains a day.
And how long is the siding that you're proposing for the Delta area?
For the Delta area, would be a rather short siding, at least in the initial look, because it's just to service the local area. I don't think there's room in the Delta area to actually place one of these long sidings that we need to meet trains. But we do have, and you'll notice later on, we've got a operations study that needs to be done that looks at the entire railroad. We've done a lot of tweaks to the alignment. One is a major tweak, if you will, in Canada. And so we need to relook at the operating plan to see where the sidings would fit. And again, we want to place those sidings where they minimize interaction with roads and the access network in the area. So, and also that if there is any noise, that it's kind of outside of the main town area. But we also need to provide for that service to the town too. So we've got to fit that and work that with the train operation. So I think I can't fully answer your question, but those are the right.
It does. I have one further question, if I might, and that is, did I hear you correctly when you said that going through the Delta area, you would have overpasses or underpasses and avoid any on-grade crossings?
Yes, that I think is critical. You've got an existing transportation network, you've got major roads, and actually when we talk about the Delta area, we'll see how we avoided a crossing just by changing the alignment. And so we've got to do that, and then we need to work with the landowners in the area to make sure we maintain the connectivity across the property.
Okay, thank you.
And was that Pete asking the question?
Yep, it was.
Hey, Pete, I can recognize your voice even though I haven't seen you in more than a decade. I hope you're doing well.
Is that me? Yeah, that's me. Okay.
Yeah. Hey, one of the things is in a specific, it may be that you've got a grade crossing on a four-wheeler trail or going across somebody's farm where it just might be a tractor that's likely to use the crossing. But for any major highways, you do that. And frankly, because this will be taking the Alaska Railroad up to kind of class 1 status, there's all sorts of federal regulations and incentives to do that as well. I'll tell you something I learned when we got into this business is that railroads tend to look at roads and say that the crossing's your problem, not our problem. I think for us as a new build construction, it's definitely our problem. It's got to be part of our capital costs.
Well, that's been our major worry here is, is trains holding up people trying to get to work, crossing Jarvis Creek on the Richardson, things like that, ambulance, fire response, school buses. So, as long as we're not going to have major blockages because we have so few roads, that's comforting. Thank you, Meade.
Thank you.
And I wanted to also, sorry, Don.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I thank you. It's these type of meetings and follow-up discussions that help us make sure we fit the environment and meet the needs of the community as we build something.
Absolutely. And on that note, I just wanted to share a question that's in the Q&A box with everybody. And it's asking if there will be a detailed map of the route through Delta Junction and impact to homeowners. And so as you can see, we're kind of heading in that direction in the slide presentation. So hopefully you feel by the end you have a better sense of what the route through your area looks like. And we will kind of with that, I don't see any other hands raised, and so I'll hand it back over to you, Don, to continue with the slides, and we'll pause again for questions here in a little bit.
So Solly jumped on one slide on me, which was a good one to show. So this, yeah, go back one, Solly. One more. So I think this is a good example of what we've done on the alignment. The original DHI alignment, which was the original study done back in 2012 and ended up in 2016, is this bottom pinkish line. And that basically built the railroad down the Ladue floodplain. It had multiple tunnels. And then as you came out into the Tanana Basin, it actually built the railroad essentially on top of the Alaska Highway. And or in the river. So none of those is desirable. We looked at several different routes in the corridor. The green line was one route that we looked at, had a longer tunnel, and then we ended up with that route in the middle where you see that little marker at that says tunnel with the white line. That's our mile-long tunnel that we have. We did good crossings on the Ladue River and stayed out of the floodplain elsewhere. We looked at the trails in the area that are historical trails. There's one spot that we'll have to do a mitigation. And then as we came out into the Tanana Basin, we stayed between the highway and the toe of the mountains so that we fit the environment there to work through. So those are all things that we looked at just to give you an idea of what we did and to get the grades improved, reduce the tunnel length, and then get the earthwork and better fit everything around the area. Let's go to the next one, Polly. This is another one. The upper pinkish line is the original DHI alignment, which kind of just went across country down the floodplain of the Tanana, which is not a good place to be, especially in spring and summer runoff. And so we looked at that alignment and started moving it towards the Alaska Highway. We know there's a cemetery there we have to miss. There's a park we have to miss. The bridge across Canada was rebuilt. We need to be far enough aware because there's a new park and boat launch as well there. But that seems a better fit. And then where you see that whitish line where the markers are, as we worked with the Customs and Border Protection folks, looked at the areas, the border crossing itself, Petland Junction is a spot, and then here, that's where the best spot seemed to be for all concerned, including the Customs and Border Protection agents who wanted a place to live without having to drive 70 or 80 miles in the middle of winter to get to their duty spot to stay. So that's where we have our port of entry. And then as you can kind of see, we moved around the town, tried to stay away from some of the development areas, and then hug the highway as much as we could as we could get back to it. So that's what we did to get around Tok. Go ahead, Polly. And then Dot Lake was another one where the DHI alignment went right through the middle of the village. We looked at a couple routes there and ended up with one that went completely around the village to avoid all the issues there. We're still working on the Dot Lake alignment, but this gives you an idea of some of what we've done to try to fit everything with the alignment and avoid things. And then you'll see the development with all the subdivided land on the left side of your screen. That's an area where rather than go right through the middle of all the properties, we tried to stay as close to the road as possible and avoid as many of the landowners' impacts as we could. Go ahead, Solly. And then we come to Delta Junction, where you've all been waiting very patiently to see what we did there. You'll see the gold line in this case is the original DHI alignment. It got within about 10 kilometers or so of Delta Junction, about 6 miles. It actually went across the Alaska Highway, went on the north side, right in the middle of a bunch of lands that looked like they were agricultural. And the funny thing is when they did this, they did not connect with the Northern Rail Extension Railroad. And so we scratched our heads a little bit and said, that's probably not the best place to be. So we looked at keeping the alignment south of the Alaska Highway. There's a private airstrip in there, what's designated as airstrip, going around that, going around some of the what looked like agricultural lands, looking at the properties that we were crossing, and also trying to stay right along the edge of the base as well. So I think we've got a good fit. I know there's going to be some discussions on landowner access. I worked with the landowners through here, but that's where we're at now. And believe it or not, we connected with the end of the NRE just north of Jarvis Creek. In talking with Brian Lindebooth, the chief engineer, when they did the NRE, they were thinking that that would be a great separated crossing of the Richardson Highway. We crossed TAPS as well, which would also be great separated so they can maintain the TAPS pipeline and not have to dig through the railroad. And so there's that, and that's part of the consideration. When you go up in the air, about 21 feet is what we'll have to be to grade separate over. Because of Jarvis Creek and the water in there, I don't think it will be able to go under. We've got to come back down again. It'll take us about a mile to get back down to grade through there. So we've got to take all that into consideration when we start locating where our little spur can go there to serve Delta Junction. So those are some of the considerations in the alignment we've done. And I'll pause here to see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Don, for pausing. And I don't see any hands raised. Actually, yeah, the Delta Library has raised their hand. So you are unmuted, I see, and you're definitely ask away. And I don't see any Q&A in the Q&A box yet. But if you do have something, type it in there and we'll read it.
Yes, you talk about it looks like you're coming pretty much right up the Alaska Highway from the Clearwater Road area, Remington Road area. There's a lot of homes in there. Have you give that any consideration? I see you made great efforts to go around Toke and Dot Lake and some other places, but why through downtown Delta?
We've tried as we went south of the highway to avoid what homes we could find. As we get better aerial photography in that, we'll be able to fine tune that. Our corridor that we're working within right now is 1,000 feet wide. If we need to make some shifts to avoid some things, we'll make the shifts. So this is what, based on the information we have, what we could do. And we know there's going to be some refinements as we start working with people and identifying the land crossings and what needs to be done.
Where does that 1,000-foot corridor start from, the highway, or where's that just a surveyed line out there?
The corridor itself, if you will, if you see a blue line on one side and there's a green line on the other, that's pretty much the demarcation of the 1,000 feet.
Yeah, well, okay. Because I think there's quite a few residents in there. I don't know. I'm just curious how you'll deal with that.
Yeah. As we get more information, we'll look at where we need to refine it, go around. And if we can't, then we'll be talking to the landowner.
So this is Meade. Let me just add to this. One of the things that we've got to do before we, formally work with the Alaska Railroad to apply for the 460 permit is identify the landowners, the private landowners whose land we'd cross. And what we would obviously very much like to avoid is any sort of right-of-way situation where the federal government is essentially ordering us to a particular route that has eminent domain attached to it and all of that sort of thing. So we do want to work with you and your community to identify the best route here. Obviously, we've got to aim for that bridge. The times that several of us have been out there looking at the land, we've seen some subdivisions that are subdivided but not built, and it's probably now a good time to identify what's going to be built and what's not going to be built in the near term. And if there are are suggestions that the community has. Let's work together. You know, it's pretty hard to go way north or way south and hit that bridge, but we've got to make something work.
Yeah. So if those of you have this up on a large screen, just to give you a better feel, there's 2 green lines. That's the demarcation of the 1,000-foot corridor. Roughly centered in that is a blue line, and that's essentially the railroad that we're looking at right now. And that railroad in this area is probably about 100 foot of right-of-way. Since we're flat enough, the need for the right-of-way will widen out a little bit as we approach Richardson Highway, because we've started building an embankment to go up. But there's ways around that if we need to be tight because of some feature there or the residents that we need to miss. So that's kind of where it's at. I can't guarantee we miss everything. Having been out there and looked at the area, I think we missed most. But we're working with aerial photography at high level, and we may have missed residents to something that's in the trees. And that's some of the feedback we need to get from you all so that we can make sure we get this best fit.
We have 2 questions in the Q&A box that I would like to read that's definitely related to this. And for Don, if you could address this, and if Mead would like to jump in as well. Terry asked, how do we get a better map of the route south of Delta along the Alaska Highway? So that's one of our 2 questions I have for you guys.
Right now, we're working with the KMZ drawing, so we can work through A2A and make that available, I believe.
Okay. And I think if we have some really great lines of communication with the community of Delta at this point with setting up this meeting. So I believe Sean will remain the point of contact when it comes to as definitely with the maps as well. So we'll plan to follow up. That's an action item that we will take note of. And also this meeting is being recorded for our purposes only. Just so you know, we're taking notes, as I mentioned earlier, but we're also recording just so we can keep track of the questions and the communication that we're getting. The other question was, why can't they go closer to the mountains? And that was an anonymous attendee. Don, would you like to take a stab at that question?
Closer to the mountains, which I believe is to the north, puts us way through, and you can see all this developed area north of the Alaska Highway. That's an area that is fraught with environmental considerations, residences, agricultural area. We'd like to avoid that, and we need to connect with the NRE. And as I mentioned earlier, the NRE has an approved route that's been through the NEPA process, and it's good to go. And they also stayed away from the mountains on the north and east side of the Tanana, and stayed to the west and south of the Tanana. The entire route, once they cross Delta, their entire route stays on that side of the road. So we need to connect it.
Thank you, Don, for answering those questions. And it looks like we don't have any hands raised or questions. Actually, one just popped up in the Q&A box. So it was the person that asked the question about the map south of Delta, and the answer, if you can hear me, I don't know if the maybe the audio for Don's answer was not as loud. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but we will follow up and provide those maps. And I think we are okay to continue with our slide presentation, Don.
Okay, Sully? So I wanted to give you a picture or a feel of what it's like to build a railroad, what some of the features look like. On the far right-hand side is the turn of the 1900s tunnel building. We've progressed a little bit with some modern equipment since then, but the technique's the same. You start at the top and then build the bottom. It's a horseshoe-shaped tunnel, and you can see some of the size of the tunnel and go. That gives you an idea when we start talking about a mile-long tunnel. We'll start at both ends, and you'll essentially have a crew, 30 to 40 people working on each end towards the center when this goes, and they get about 15 to 20 feet a day of production on each end. So let's go on, Polly. The Valdez route, and when you speak of tunnels, this route has a few of them. We start at Toke, basically run along the Toke cutoff and down to Ken Island, stay away from the Copper River, and then cross Thompson Pass down into Valdez. And that route has 5 tunnels, as you can see, with the longest being 2.9 miles and the shortest being 2,400 feet. 31,000 feet of tunnels. We know it's got 62 bridges for grade separating the roads, or what we would do. In Delta Junction, we cross the PAPS pipeline, and that's 270 miles around. So that just gives you an idea of what we've looked at on a high-level feasibility study to see if it would work. Go ahead, Sally. And then we also looked at port of entry, like I mentioned. We had 3 locations: the border near Tetland Junction and the Alaska. The border, when you're looking at a 50-mile road plus the drive from the nearest community, which is Hope, that becomes, especially in wintertime, an area that the Customs and Border Protection people said that's not good for our people. We need to look somewhere else. We looked at Tetland Junction. Part of that border crossing would have ended up on a bridge over the highway going north. As a result of that, the Border Protection people said, we've got to set a secure site. There's a fence and secure area around this entire port of entry. That's not good either. And so we looked at Toke. We've got housing for everybody. We can secure the area. It fits very nicely with the alignment and the terrain. That's where we think the best spot to be our Customs and Border Protection facility. That's where our port of entry is. We have a presidential permit that's sitting in the White House now, and that will go from there. I'll start with these studies, Meade, and then if you want to jump in there. Van Horn Institute was the starting of the study. Its final report was made in 2015. It started work in 2012. McKinsey and Company did an economic analysis, which Meade will provide some information on later on. We've used local University of Alaska Fairbanks involvement with the initial feasibility, expansion, economic benefits. We're also talking with them on permafrost and other issues. And then we ourselves looked at verifying the VHR report for Sean McCaution, looked at the initial route alignment to see if it was workable or not. We reviewed that. And that's where we found out that, yeah, the original route built on top of the Alaska Highway, which is not good. We looked at the existing infrastructure on the Alaska Railroad, as well as, how can we move these trains on the Alaska Railroad and what it has for features and trackage and facilities, and how we get through the Denali Park with essentially double tracking, and then looked at the Valdez route this year. So those are all things that have been ongoing, and we've got a lot of work yet to do on this project, which will involve your input as well. Go ahead, Meade, do you have anything you want to add?
Meade, you are muted. Just a heads up.
Okay, well, what I just said isn't important anyway. Don, thanks for that. Some of these studies are available publicly. Some of them we have extracts. We've got some extracts from the McKinsey study in the slide deck today. That was done for internal purposes to help us identify some of our marketing targets, as well as to help in the investment side. So there's parts of it that are proprietary, but all of these other studies are available to the public, and we can help explain to you if you have questions of why did we change what was in the Van Horn route or the Van Horn concept or the University of Alaska concepts before. But our firm belief is it's time to move from studies to actually permits and getting this built.
Guys, we actually have 2 questions from the Q&A box. Before we get too far along into the studies, if you don't mind, well, they're more related to the proposed route, and I know we've kind of shifted from that part of the presentation. I'm wondering if you want to just wait and answer these at the end, or how do you feel about that, Don and Mead? Should we continue on with this and then answer the, we have a few more route-related questions that have come up.
Oh, that's kind of what I expected, Joy, was lots of questions about the route. And while we're close to that slide on that thing, maybe you want to back up to those 2 slides and
Okay.
I will answer. It's either going to be about process or it's going to be about why did you choose this? So.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you for that, Mead. That was kind of my inclination as well. So Judy asked, the proposed route along the Alaska Highway in Delta Junction crosses many private land parcels. Was a route along the border of military training areas considered?
Don, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, it was getting through there that was part of the problem. So we tried to hug the highway as much as we could and then cross. And we are kind of along the military reservation on part of this. So if there's some suggestions as we talk to the landowners and get through that, we can move this to address that. It's to some extent you rob Peter and pay Paul with some of these decisions. So that's why it's so critical that we work with you all over the next few months to try to get this refined. And I know that's not a good answer, but that's what we've tried to do, is do a best fit and minimize the impacts, but also recognize, yeah, we can be along the boundary a little bit, but to get to there, we created more impacts. So we're trying to get a balance.
So, Soli, if I can ask you a question, you've developed a list of the private landowners, and I know we've got a little bit more, a little bit more property research to do. Tom Kretschmer is a right-of-way expert with HDR, who's also on the line with us today. How many private parcels do we cross in the Delta area, Sean?
I'm muting myself here and getting my video up. So that's a good question, Mead. Right now, we're still, as you said, refining some of those details in the Delta area. But it looks like roughly about 50 private landowners based on our analysis. You know, at this point, we're basing the majority of our research using DNR and BLM databases and mapping databases. And as you all probably know from using the recorder's office and things like that, there's some inconsistency in the documentation. So further analysis will take place at a later date and time in terms of underlying property interests and all that type of stuff. But I would like to say that in general, we're aware that there's additional work that needs to be done. Sorry about that, I got a private phone call there. But we're aware that more work needs to be done. And Tom, if you want to provide any more color on kind of the next steps for that and what you and I have discussed, maybe that would be a good time to do so.
Sure, Sean. This is Tom Kretschmer with HDR in Anchorage. As Sean mentioned, there are some gaps in the records along the alignment. And Delta Junction is probably one of the easier areas to actually investigate because some of those parcels have been subdivided and they've been transferred. But the DNR and BLM systems are not perfect in Alaska. And there are a lot of places that require very in-depth investigations. And we haven't gotten to that phase yet. We have kind of concentrated on Delta South, and so we know more, but we don't know everything. And ultimately, the best source will be a title search from a title company, and we just we haven't gotten there yet, but we can narrow it down some at this point. So I hope that helps.
Joy, you had another question.
Yep. Thank you, Tom,
Thanks,
for
Tom.
jumping. Yeah, thanks, Tom, for jumping in as well. One of the additional questions was, how will you mitigate bison migration, and how can you avoid warning whistle noise near communities? Will the route be fenced? And I know some of this may be coming up later on in the presentation, but Dawn, I'll hand it over to you on wildlife mitigation. And we have 2 new questions as well. So I'll hand it over to you, Dawn. Thank you.
So wildlife mitigation on the bison range, we're skirting along the very northern edge and stay out of the main part of the bison range. And then we've also got, I think we've got some slides later on that show some of the mitigation measures. One of the neat things, I've had the experience, and I do it on a weekly basis, so driving through our Taylor Reservation north of town, they are one of the leaders in the nation as far as what I call critter crossings, but actually get mitigation measures to have ways for the animals and wildlife cross over or under the infrastructure, and it's worked very neat. And with some of the photos that are in the slides, you'll see we have very photogenic wildlife down here. So these are all things that we plan on doing and instigating as we do the environmental studies, do the wildlife studies, look at migration patterns, and get those studies, and we start incorporating the features that we need to protect the wildlife as we also build the railroad, and so we don't have the conflicts. It's quite messy when a train happens to hit a wildlife or an animal. By the same token, we want to avoid those as much as we can. So we need to design around it. That's what we're committing to do.
Great. Thank you for that answer, Dawn. And I believe there was a part of that also about the route being fenced. Did you answer that as well?
The route being what? Sorry.
Fenced in.
Oh, where we need to, we will fence the route, especially near populated areas. As we work with the landowners, that fence will become part of the agreement as we need to. And so that also becomes a maintenance issue for the railroad as well. But those are all things that need to be worked out as we go through. Fencing with some wildlife works. We also have to design the fence so the wildlife can get through it. And there's types of fence that occurs as well, where we allow free movement of the wildlife. So those are all considerations that take into place both during the environmental process, because that's part of what we have to actually feed the NEPA document, as well as the design of the project and the construction for it.
Thank you very much, Don. And another question is the route following the eminent domain route south of Delta?
It's in many of the parcels, and when you say eminent domain, I believe you're talking about the parcels that were set aside for the DNR 460 process. We do, for the most part, are on the same parcels. We may not follow the alignment exactly, because when those parcels and that alignment was created, the standards weren't as good as they are now, if you will, for running trains, or what we need to do to run trains. There's also a few areas where the alignment actually messes with the environment too much. And so we've avoided and made choice to avoid the environmental considerations and try to get a little bit better route as a result.
Thank you, Don, for that question, or sorry, for that answer. And one clarification question that came up that was answered.
Hey, Joy, can I interrupt for just a second?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure who the questioner was or what the point on eminent domain, and I was the person who first used the words eminent domain in this evening, and I want to be real clear. Our intent, obviously, as anybody with a right-of-way trying to do it, is to try to secure right-of-way by negotiation and community discussion. with the public landowners and not to have to use eminent domain with private landowners. And that's our policy at A2A. The land south of Delta would be part of the 460 process, which would be essentially the state designating state-owned lands for this corridor. And as we approach a greater concentration of private lands in the Delta area, we'd obviously like to work with landowners, and you know, eminent domain for a railroad is something that is not necessarily handled by the state level. It's handled more at the federal level, and it's much more blunt instrument. And frankly, it's our intent to try to work with the communities that we're going to be a part of for the next 100 years to do it right. So, you know, if I just want to state what I said at the beginning of the meeting is we want to work as closely as we can with Delta as we get down to short strokes in identifying the corridor here and working with the landowners and the community. Thanks, Joy.
Thank you, Mead. And I just wanted to read a quick question for clarification on the 50 private landowners that was mentioned. And the question was, is that total along the route or 50 in the Delta area? And Sean answered the question in the Q&A box, and he said that there are 50 private landowners along the route, and roughly 35 of those are in the Delta area. So just wanted to clarify that for folks listening in. And we are going to, at this time, just doing a quick time check. It's about 7:50. It'd be great if we got through some more of our slides here, and then we will open it up for questions and comments as well at the end. So with that, I will hand it back over to Mead and to Don. Thank you.
And Sean, if you would go ahead and move ahead to the slide, please. There, future studies. Real quickly, to refine the route more between Pentland Junction and Delta, we need some additional survey done. And to get the survey that we did do on the New River area, we had that put in the can, if you will, and we just need to get the data cleaned up and refined in order to get to that area. So we have all the survey done. That gives us the detail that we need to do to get the alignment. And when we do survey between Pentland Junction and Delta Junction, we'll take the additional photographs. So it'll give us a lot better aerial photography than the word. Operations, it's critical, as I've talked before. We've got to look at the train performance, look at the overall operations plan, and review the business case to make sure it works. And then Valdez, as we work with the city of Valdez, and on the Valdez route, we've also got to finish the terminal port facilities feasibility study to assist in the decision-making process for the Valdez route. So those are all things coming up, a lot of work. And as we get that route refinement process going, that's where we need to get your input, especially ahead of time and during, so that we can take into those crossing information, land information, working on benchmark, solid, so that we get this fit in the right spots where it needs to be. Go ahead, Solly.
Let me take on some of the economics things that we've learned. I mentioned that we did a study done by McKinsey for A2A rail, and the investment side, the cost of the economics of this project, as you can see in the first column, we're looking at spending about $4 billion in Alaska. These are Canadian dollars, so that's equivalent to about $3 billion US, $7.3 billion in the Yukon, and $3.4 billion in the Northwest Territories, and about $5.9 billion Canadian in Alberta. The GDP impact of that kind of spending is going to mean a lot of construction jobs. It's going to mean a lot of operating jobs. And the studies also show that it has the potential impact to raise the GDP perhaps 10% in Alaska. You know, the GDP of Alaska right now is about $50 billion. And so this is a $5 billion annual shot in the arm for the state's economy, very positive. It actually has a larger impact on the Yukon, and perhaps its largest economic impact on the Yukon because of the prospect of new mines there. But a large part of the impact in Alaska is not only on the intermodal ports and the sorting yards that we've talked about in the interior, but also it will dramatically help the Port of Anchorage, the Port of Matsu, and maybe the Port of Valdez as we go forward. Again, just in terms of the employment impact in Alaska, we're looking at about 4,200 construction jobs and about 3,200 permanent jobs that are created by this project just in our state alone. Let's go to the next slide. We see this benefiting sectors that are almost 60% of the Alaska economy, including increased tax revenue for the public sector, expanded market access to Asia for the oil and gas mining sector, and access to other perhaps supplies for our refineries from Canada, where that can supplement what comes down from Prudhoe Bay, which is sometimes limited by the royalty share. Logistics and trade, we see a significant growth in that business in Alaska. And construction is not only supporting a construction industry, but also continued maintenance of the railroad during its time of operation. Manufacturing, we see increased demand for construction materials. Telecom, we see the fiber optic line bringing greater broadband to the areas that we crossed. And agriculture and forestry, increased exports along the rail route. And I know there's been significant discussion in your area, other parts of the interior, about transportation and its impact on timber development. We didn't mention agriculture here, but I've been aware of and followed the growth of agriculture in the Delta region really since the Hammond administration. And it's transportation and having alternative markets is impacted by rail, and we think that's also very important. Let's go to the next slide. There's a lot of opportunities for companies that are in Alaska to assist in construction and in operation. And that's everything from environmental engineering companies, surveys, historical surveys, geotechnical work, design support. We see a lot of work in construction in terms of contractor personnel. We've already had contractors who haul gravel and have gravel yards along our route contact us, and we expect to have more. We see a large opportunity for operations and maintenance, and that can be either environmental compliance monitoring, running train crews, yard training personnel, mechanical, and so forth. And at the appropriate time, I expect we'll be working with the various entities in Alaska, some of the union training centers, some of the state training centers, to help people get qualified to do some of these jobs, because there's going to be a lot more jobs. Let's go to the next slide. I just want to thank publicly the support that we've gotten for moving this project along. And, I guess I'll say, if you invest in a project like this, it's like buying a lottery ticket. You've got to spend money that you may never ever see back until you get through getting the land set, getting the permits done, doing that. And it's been very good to have people in our state government, our national government, encourage this project along the way. I want to shout out to Governor Dunleavy, who sent a letter to the White House in February of last year urging the president to not only issue a border permit for this project, but to change the process of looking at a border permit. He continues to demonstrate his support. We've had him talk to the president about it. The presidential permit has not been issued yet, but the Alaskans keep working on it. He wrote an article about the Alaska economy in a Washington newspaper, mentioned our project, and has been very supportive in many different ways. The Alaska State Legislature passed SJR 11, signaling support for the issuance of the presidential permit. And The Alaska Congressional Delegation has sent a letter to the White House urging this presidential permit. And I have to say that I really want to give a shout out right now to Don Young and Dan Sullivan, who've been very much pressing the White House on this issue. We've had support from communities in Fairbanks, and very honestly, again, we would like to work with Delta on this and make you more aware of some of the big issues that we've got to get done in Washington to have this addressed properly. And one of them really is the presidential permit. And let me just explain. It's required it's been required since Lyndon Johnson's time, at least, in the president in the 60s, that you get the permission of the president in order to build any kind of infrastructure across the U.S.-Canada or U.S.-Mexico border. And that was usually one of those easy permits you would get at the end. And right now, because there's been so much of a argument about various pipelines crossing from Canada into the United States, it has become a major permit in the eyes of people who have to finance projects like this. The ideas in the minds of people who have to ship projects like this. And so that's why we asked for this permit very early, and we're very happy to have the state support that we've had in trying to get it. Let's go to the next slide. We also have had a significant outreach and work with Native corporations along the route. I'd like to thank Joy for her work in that area, and Doyon for helping to convene the villages that are part of the Doyon region. We got a letter of support from Tetlin Native Corporation, which between Tetlin Native Corporation and Tetlin Tribe is working with mining in their area. But we see some land that we would be crossing that's theirs. Tanacross also sent a letter to the White House urging this presidential permit, and we've been talking with Tanacross extensively about some areas where we would need to put the customs facility in Tok, as well as perhaps some switching facilities. Fairbanks Economic Development Council has been very supportive of the project and issuance of the permit. And PENWAR, which is actually a collection of legislators from the western part of Canada, Alaska, and the North Pacific Northwest of the United States, has made this one of their projects. And I have to say that some of the things that we've been able to get done in Washington to help define our permitting path happened because PENWAR, a group of legislators, started asking questions ahead of us, and I want to thank them. Let's go to the next slide. Our next steps. We talk about the Alaska DNR 460 process. And again, just explain the history. During Governor Murkowski's administration in the early part of this century, the Alaska legislature said to the Alaska Railroad, you have the right to actually invest in Canada if you need to do that to help get a rail link to the lower 48. You have the right to ask DNR to give you the land that's necessary for the corridor. You have the right to work with others who also want to assist on this. And it was under that general law that we made the agreement with the Alaska Railroad, the master agreement last year, to raise the outside money to spend the outside money on the engineering and the permitting to identify where we need it. And so we're at the point now where we've worked with Indigenous engagement. We're engaging with Delta formally today for the first time, working to gather available information. And we're compiling DNR 460 desktop studies where we're answering the kinds of questions that would come up in a public process, all aimed at submitting a 460 application to DNR through the Alaska Railroad sometime later this year, early next year. And DNR will announce its own calendar about that process. But the reason why we're here in Delta tonight is to have a discussion with you long ahead of this, so that if we need to change something or if we have some issues that we need to work out, we have a chance to work them out before they are turned over to the regulators. So that's our process within the state of Alaska. Let's go to the next slide. The environmental impact statement for a rail connection, for those of you who are involved with the Northern Rail extension that permitted the rail connection down from North Pole to Delta. It's a It's a process that's run by the Surface Transportation Board. We were told recently by the Federal Permit Improvement Steering Council that there might be arguments to have the Corps of Engineers be the lead on this, but right now our assumption is that it will be the Surface Transportation Board. We've had several meetings with them. They usually hire a third-party consultant to write the EIS that we have to pay for. They also go through the process where we would have a scoping meeting like this in Delta Junction and other points along the route. We would draft the EIS and answer many of the questions that came up tonight with formal studies, and that could be anything from where's the fences to what's your noise mitigation issue. Once there are public comment on the EIS, they can move to a final EIS and then issue a record of decision. I'm not going to put, the president has put out executive orders that says that EIS process should take about 2 years, and EISs in the United States have taken longer than that. We're working to get our homework done so that when we submit the application, it's a complete application, and that there's not going to say mark time while you do some additional studies. So that's one of the reasons why we're engaging here now tonight. Next step. Next slide, if you can, please. So I've mentioned the presidential border crossing permit. We're very frank and open about the fact that we're still identifying the landowners and the best route, but we need to work with landowners for agreements on rights of way. We've been working on a financial model for the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Commission Corporation, and I don't know if you can see the video, but there's an act that created a corporation that allows Indigenous, that helps Indigenous entities, First Nations in Canada, invest in this project. And we're also working on ways that Native entities in Alaska can be part of the equity ownership of the project. I've mentioned the 460 application all the time earlier, and the STB process now. And we're going to keep working with stakeholders, including Alaska's ports, where you can't really have a railroad to connect Alaska to the lower 48 without having good relationships with the ports. And we're working, we've been working with the Port of Matsu, the Port of Alaska at Anchorage, the Port of Valdez, and I can even see advantages that this project will have for places as far away as Skagway, Haines, Whittier, Seward, all which may not be directly impacted by the construction, but would be helping to supply material. Next slide, please. We're now down to discussion and questions, and I'm going to turn this back over to Joy and see. Let's see what we learn.
Thank you so much, Mead and Dawn, for doing the majority of the presenting this evening. And I hope that everyone that is listening and that has logged in has learned something, hopefully learned a lot about where the project is right now. I know that we do have some questions here. And so I'm going to read some of these questions out for them to be answered. And also, if you do have comments, at this point, I think we are open to questions, but also we want to have a discussion with you. So if you have any direct comments as well, please raise your hand. I'm going to get to the Q&A box first, but if you want to take a moment to raise your hand if you have any questions or comments, of course, there's the raise hand button down at the bottom of your screen for most of our participants that have logged on the computer, but *9 for our few phone representatives or phone participants, *9 is how you raise your hand, and we will open your line at that time. So for the Q&A box, I wanted to read a few questions that have come up just in the last few minutes here. And one of them is from Chris. And the question is, with no taxes in Delta, how will revenue benefit the community? Mead, I will kick that question over to you. And you're muted.
I'm sorry. Actually, my doors are open and there's airplanes flying outside, so I keep muting. Joy, can you repeat the question again?
Yep. With no taxes in Delta, how will the revenue benefit the community?
Well, I guess probably the best way to put it is that Delta, like other communities in the state, certainly benefit from state tax revenue. And I have to say that taxes in Delta are really a decision up to Delta. But we see benefits to the community, certainly with jobs. We see benefits to the community with the ways that we're going to help with education, certainly in job training. And we also see having a rail line as something that helps facilitate other industry that pays property taxes or pays people to work. So frankly, we haven't gotten down to the level of local taxes in our financial modeling, and I'd love to learn more about the situation.
Thank you, Mead. And another question that came up that was answered by Sean, and I'll just share this with folks so that they can kind of keep up with some of the information. And the question was, hold on a second. Is the Alaska Railroad set up to handle increase in freight car and locomotive maintenance? They currently run 1 freight train a day, and A2A will increase that to 8 to 10 freight trains a day. And Sean's response was, in our work with the Alaska Railroad, we've identified improvements to their system that will need to be made to handle A2A trains and cars. More details on that will be available once a more robust operations study is complete. We expect to take on that work in 2021. Don will add more details on this. So Don, that's your cue. If you have any more details on maintenance and the capacity for the Alaska Railroad, that would be great.
Yeah, we did a pretty good study along there looking at the train operations, the impacts, how they could maintain their passenger train operations with additional freights, where would the additional trackage need to be placed, and like I mentioned, that essentially meant that there would be some double track areas through the Denali National Park adjacent to the existing main line. So those are the type of infrastructure. They've got some major bridges. We'd be building a second bridge alongside those bridges. So those are things that we looked at. I know the yard in the area in Fairbanks needs to be studied in more detail, as well as the facilities in the Anchorage area to receive that many trains a day and work through that. But we did a high enough level study. We know what the impacts are. More detail is needed, as Sean noted, and we're ready to take those next steps.
Thank you, Don, for answering that question. And another question is from Kelly. As one of those 50 landowners who would be hugely impacted by the proposed route, I don't think you adequately answered the question regarding the decision to avoid military land to the south. Rather than jogging to the north at KP 2560, why can the route not go slightly south along the flat, unoccupied military land? That would avoid major private landowners. So I'll pass that over to you, Don, to answer that question, if you can. And yes.
Yeah. And that may be one of the things we need to look at with your input. When we initially looked at it, it looked like that might create some more environmental impacts, but we're willing to talk through that and see what needs to happen. And if that works out as a better route, then we'll move it.
And Kelly, this is Mead. I really wanted to be in Delta tonight, and this whole COVID situation has made community meetings by Zoom some a little bit easier because I can go home and sleep in my own bed tonight, but not easier to have you take me over and show me what the impact would be and those things. I've spent, I've been in Delta probably for 2 days this year and just doing reconnaissance with our team, and we're very interested in talking with you and learning more. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Mead. And there was a question that came up asking, is there a timeline for talking to individual landowners? And that is a great question. And we are in the process of completing a more thorough review, and we'll send out invitations once that is complete. And so you should see something over the next few months. And thank you, Sean, for weighing in on that response. So thank you. That's a very good question. And another question, this is directed, I think at you, Mead. It says, Mead stated that mineral development and shipments are needed to support the cost of the railroad. Is A2A working with mineral developers?
We're interested in working with mineral developers. And Sean, if you want to take down the slideshow, it means that we can see each other on video maybe a little bit better now too. I think the short answer is this, is that there are mineral developers in places like Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Northwest Territories, Yukon, and Alaska, all of whom could be shippers on this railroad. It's less likely that we're going to be a major supplier of transportation services for gold mines, but for those mines that need to carry heavy concentrates to a smelter, for example, those are groups that we're interested in working with. We've made sure at this point we've got we want to avoid conflicts with existing mineral claims. So we've talked to some of the mines in Alaska where they've got mineral claims near us. There's actually a fairly interesting prospect right about at the Canadian border. But if you've got something specific where you'd like us to talk to you or to somebody that you're working with, we'd be delighted.
Thank you, Mead, for answering that question. And another question is from Janet. This is truly a mega project. How is it going to be funded? And I will let Mead answer that question.
Wait a second, I lost my checkbook here. Normally a project like this is funded really in three stages, okay? The first is money that you may never see again because you may never get past the first stage, and that's been provided by Sean McCoshen, the sole owner of A2A, but who's been working with a group of investment banks on this, and he also is the owner of a couple of rail construction companies, and has had vast experience building grain terminals and other infrastructure around North America. The second stage of financing is that what I'll say is $200 to $600 million for engineering and permitting to get to a point where our cost estimate is down to a plus or minus number that is acceptable to bankers. And then the third phase of financing is where you're going to large international global sources of money. And I'm on a call tomorrow with where I'll be presenting on this and some other infrastructure in Alaska to a group of financiers in Asia. Robert Dove, who works on this, has identified several large sources. We've identified at least one major group of investors in Canada that want to be part of that next stage if the presidential permit comes through and we're able to move that along. But every single one of those financiers at stage 2 and frankly stage 3, more importantly stage 3, want to know, is there a commitment to use the railroad by shippers if the railroad is built? And that's where we're talking to people who are shipping containers, shipping companies, mining companies, as I already mentioned, grain producers, grain co-ops, potash producers, sulfur producers, bitumen producers, all to see what we need. And the McKinsey study helped identify who those players are and where those goods would go being exported to Asia. So the answer is this: it's, if you and I were going to finance a shopping center, the banks might ask us, who are the main clients going to be? Is there going to be a Safeway at one end and a Target at the other? And if you have that, it makes the shopping center a little bit easier to finance. And we're looking with some of these shippers to sign long-term contracts. But frankly, we needed to get the right-of-way understood, the permitting understood, and this presidential permit out of the way before we could have those discussions as seriously as we'd like.
Thank you, Mead. And a question on the economics of the project from Chris. After completion of construction, how many full-time jobs are anticipated in the community?
I don't think we've broken it down by community, but the number that I had in the slideshow before, and unfortunately I don't have it printed out right here in front of me, but one of the things that I think we're going to see specifically of 4,000 plus jobs in Alaska that we expect this project will generate for full time is there are going to be some communities which will be sorting hubs. Frankly, if you unloaded a big container ship in Anchorage right now, there's no place to sort all those containers to see which ones go to Chicago and which ones go to Toronto and which ones go to Salt Lake. So it's quite likely that everything will be put on a train, and the sorting yard may well be in the interior, and it could be near Delta, it could be near Tok. There's that kind of an opportunity. There's quite a bit of work in maintenance. There's quite a bit of work running these trains, where there's going to be a need for more engineers and more maintenance people on the rolling stock. And so I think as we advance in our plans, you're going to see an opportunity for communities to kind of, we'll learn with you together what are some of the best opportunities. We know that customs has to be fairly near the border. We know that sorting has to be an area where you've got a large piece of land to do that. And transshipping and the intermodal work will be at several points where there's connections with highways. So we're going to be sorting that out in the next phase.
Thank you, Mead. And another question, do you have a timeline on how long before the railroad is completed? We kind of hit on that a little bit. Do you want to, I don't know if we answered it that directly. We talked about the 460 process and the potential duration of the environmental impact statement process. Mead, do you want to give a closer prediction?
If we're able to get the engineering done in the next year to 2 years, that's enough to answer the key environmental questions. Then we see about a 2-year EIS permitting process in the United States. I think it'll be about the same in Canada. I've met with the Canadian authorities before we got the Canadian president on board, so I haven't been in those meetings as much lately. So we look at something like a 3 to 4 year permitting process and a 3 to 4 year construction process. So it could be as soon as 8 years before we're in operation.
Thank you, Mead. And I believe that covers the questions that we wanted to ask in the Q&A box. And I wanted to turn to our participants that are logging in and maybe didn't you want to use the Q&A box. The Delta Library crowd has been pretty quiet lately, so I'm a little concerned. Quiet is sometimes not good in meetings like this, so just kidding. But if the Delta, I see they raised their hand, and maybe they were just patiently waiting for the Q&A box's questions to be read. So let's go ahead and open up the Delta line. You're already open and you are not muted, so you can actually, your line is currently open. And for anybody else that's logging in or has called in, please just raise your hand and we will open your line and have you provide comments or questions. And again, *9 is how you raise your hand if you're on the phone. So with that, I will open it up to the folks that have gathered at the Delta Library.
Yes, this is Dave Glover again. I'm one of the 50 that live on the Alaska Highway south side. My place is 7 miles out. How soon do you feel, I know it's all a guesstimate, you'll have a detailed map so the residents can look at it and see exactly where they're at from the highway?
Don mentioned that we've got a corridor that we've identified now, and we'd like to have individual meetings with landowners whose land that we specifically identified that we would cross, and then another community meeting. I can't, very honestly, Soley mentioned some of the issues, Sean Soley mentioned some of the issues that we've had in identifying landowners. And as soon as we get that resolved, we will work not only to contact you individually, but also to have another community session. And if there are general ideas about moving the line, some of which we've heard tonight, we want to make sure that we look at those too before we go out to individuals. So I don't know, Don or Tom, if you wanted to add to that.
Yep. Yeah, I've got a little bit more information too. I took a look at where we put the alignment, and one of the considerations we did is actually place it right alongside the highway right-of-way line. So we minimize the impact to the landowners and try to take advantage of that already existing corridor on the highway. However, if that's not an area that we should be in, we can look at other routes. I know there's the communications tower we need to miss, the base we need to miss, and I'm not too sure about the land ownership through there in that area that one person suggested. But those are all things that we can talk about a little bit more. But we were thinking it might be better to be along the highway corridor right there, along the highway right-of-way, than trying to go across country. But if that doesn't fit with the community and where people in the subdivision is there, then we need to rethink that and look at other places. So I thank you for those comments, because that's the exact type of feedback we need. And then, as Meade talked about, as soon as we get some of the individual landowners fully identified, because it is kind of a convoluted process for the records, then we can get out with the meetings and start talking individually and show maps and see what people think. I don't think that's too far away.
Okay, I've got one other thing, just a comment. Somebody asked a question about being there's no tax bases in Delta, how would it benefit the community? I've been around here a while, and Alyeska came to town and did a great job of supporting the community and the young people here. The Pogo Mine was another excellent example of supporting the community and the young people through a training center. I would like to see you guys get on board with that, and you could train people here locally to work your system maybe. Thanks for your time.
Thank you for the comment.
Thank you, Dave, for your comments and for your questions. We
do have some more.
Yep. I figured you did. I was just going to let you know we would leave it open for you, and that we do have a few in the Q&A box when we're done.
Yes, Doug Parker from Delta, and just a small little teeny landowner. And I'm concerned that so far I've only heard mention as far as landowners that are actually in the corridor. But if you have a piece of land that's outside the corridor, but the railroad is going to cut off your access to the Alcan Highway or other highway systems, and you're not next to a major road, well, then we need to address that. I think that people in Delta, landowners, need to be able to get on a list that you have to identify and have to get in touch with, so that we can make sure we don't fall through the cracks. I know you're going to cover all the large landowners and businesses, but the people with a little, homestead plot here and there are going to get left behind if we're not careful. And that's all I have to say. But please come up with a list or something we can sign up on, because people outside the corridor are affected by this as well as people inside the corridor. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Parker. And Doug, I've known other Doug Parkers, so I look forward to meeting you.
Yes, Doug, I just wanted to add, I'm glad you're able to join today's call. I know you and I played phone tag over the weekend, but glad you're here and glad we were able to hear your comments. And I will certainly be working and drafting up a list and getting that over to the city of Delta, and we'll make some movements on that here in the next few weeks, no doubt.
And Doug, this is Don. As I mentioned earlier, that is one of the key things we've got to identify going forward. It's not just the major railroads, it's all the other trails and crossings and private landowner access that exists now that we'll end up crossing. We've got to figure out who is involved with those and incorporate what needs to be done to maintain that access. So yeah, that's a commitment that we make, and it's not just a commitment that we make as an A2A organization, but it's a commitment to the NEPA process that we've got to make. So those are things that are going to be coming up, and so we very much appreciate your input, and you will be involved.
Turning it back to the Delta Library crowd, do we have any more comments or questions?
Doesn't look like it right now, Joy.
Okay, well, we will certainly come back to you, and I don't see any other hands raised from our participants, but there are a few more questions that have popped up in the Q&A box. And one of them is, with the rail running 24/7, how will the noise be mitigated during the late hours?
Part of the noise is through the grade separation. We don't have the horn blowing at every crossing, and so we'll work through that. If it is a public crossing, we've got ways to make quiet zone crossings. There will be some locomotive noises. I know the person asked why not be up above, against the mountains. If you want to know one echo chamber that occurs, is put a railroad against the mountaintop. You'll hear that railroad across the entire valley. So those are the things that go in. If we also need to, from a noise mitigation standpoint, to add some noise walls or sound walls to attenuate that, that's a blockage. From a view shed standpoint too, there's a balance there, but those are things that we consider as well.
Great, thank you, Don. And there was another related question that I think you covered with that, related to the noise. And so another question, however, is on port development. It says port development will be huge. Is it anticipated that a new port will be developed around the Port McKenzie area?
Let me try to answer that. If we already mentioned that we're looking at the Valdez alternative for bitumen, and really our two best alternatives are the port of Port McKenzie or the port of Valdez. When it comes to grains and potash and sulfur, there's a lot of laydown area. There's conduits at Port McKenzie. They have one dock now, and there may be a need for additional. When it comes to containers, my office overlooks the Port of Anchorage, Port of Alaska to Anchorage, and we've got container ships that just come in 2 days a week. So there's a lot of capacity at the port now for relatively small ships, kind of in the 1,000 TEU, 20-foot equivalent container unit. Some of the ships that cross the Pacific are much larger, and if that does happen, we may need to figure out a different container port configuration. But at this point, we think that the economics of the railroad will work with the existing ports, and probably between the oil tank terminals and the improvements, it would be several $100 million worth of improvement, but the ports themselves are adequate.
Thank you very much, Meade. And we have had 28 questions come through the Q&A box. So I don't know if you guys feel like you're getting hit left and right with them, but there's certainly been a lot of participation in the Q&A box, which I think is just a great sign that we're all really kind of welcoming and using these tools, since we can't be there in person, which is what we all want to be. And I want to emphasize again that we had planned on coming out and having at least 1 or 2 community meetings in person by now, and the COVID-19 has definitely slowed that down dramatically. And so we really do appreciate you participating tonight, and just the amount of engagement is fantastic. And again, this is the beginning of a long communication process. This is a marathon and not a sprint, and we want to be engaged with you every step along the way of that marathon. So really happy that you're all on tonight, and we have only lost a few participants, and it's been 2 hours, so that's pretty awesome. I think everybody hopefully is not only learning something, but getting to know the project team a little bit better as well. And I'm kind of waiting here to see if any more questions come up. I don't see any hands raised. We have the meeting open a little bit longer here. Again, there's multiple ways to communicate with the project team. This is not your only opportunity. I've shared my email address. a few times. I know Sean and I mean, all of us would love to continue engagement, you know, on a regular basis as you know, things progress forward. So for just the folks on the line, I wanted to share my email with everybody, and it's jhuntington, HUNTINGTON @a2arail.com. So J as in joy and Huntington @a2arail.com. So if there's any requests for getting the PowerPoint sent over, or future groups within Delta that you'd like us to give a presentation to, we're certainly open to talking to anybody and everybody about this project. And the more that we communicate, the better that this project outcome will be, and the more it will reflect the needs and interests of your community and your residents. So you're a critical part of this process, and we're glad that we're talking tonight. And I could just keep going. I think I see a question that came up. It's from Megan, and it says, thank you all for being available. So that's really nice, Megan. Thank you so much for that. And this is our pleasure, really. We appreciate you being available and everybody spending an evening with us over Zoom. And for the folks on the phone, you've been so patient without seeing any of the slides. We definitely want to make sure you get the slides as well. So please feel free to reach out to Sean. Can share some of the details on who has the presentations. I believe the Delta Library, Tiki, has the copies there.
Yes.
But we can also provide more.
Yeah, there are copies at the library. Thank you very much, Joy. There's copies at the library with Tiki, and there's also some copies at the city's office with Pat White, the city clerk. And I just wanted to reiterate what Joy said. Thank you so much. Truly, it's been fun over the last couple of weeks just to engage with the community and the different folks, the Delta Wind, the city, and looking forward to future engagements with you all. Appreciate you spending your evening with us. Moose hunting season's coming up soon, and so you all could be probably out there, doing some things on that nature. So again, thanks for joining with us. Looking forward to future engagements. And I'd just like to add my email as well. Joy will forward things on to me, but my email is ssolie@a2arail.com. Again, ssolie@a2arail.com. Just wanted to offer it since I did say that I'd follow up with some folks here. But again, thanks a lot, and hope you all have a wonderful evening. Joy and Mead, you did a great job, and Don, if you're still on, you did as well. Thanks.
Well, we got a lot of questions to answer yet, and my email is mtreadwell@a2arail.com, and very happy to answer any questions about the overall economics and some of the things that we've heard today. Thank you again.
What about you, Don? Oh, I think you're muted.
I very much appreciate the question. It helps us tailor the design to fit the area better and meet your needs as well. So I appreciate the questions. Anything that you have, do forward through Joy, Sean, or me. They will forward on to me, and I'll answer them. And we'll definitely take a look at some of the things you raised. And I even talked about the sound wall. It may actually be a green sound wall. It could be a grove of trees that gets planted or left alongside the railroad, depending on where we go through. So there's a lot of different solutions, and these are all not just items that we want to take into account in advance, but are also items that are studied under the NEPA process as well. So there's a very well thought out process to go through in the environmental, but we also want to go through that ahead of the environmental so that we prepare the project to meet the needs. And so thank you very much, and we will definitely be keeping in touch because that's what we need to do.
Thank you, Don, and thank you, everybody. And we look forward to talking to you again soon, and can't wait to be able to come out in person and answer more questions. And definitely we'll bring some of those hats that Mead is wearing, and maybe a few cups as well. We have some pretty nice coffee mugs. So look forward to seeing you all soon. And with that, I think we can officially adjourn this meeting tonight. We'll talk again soon.
Take care, everyone. Thanks again.